Welcome to this first chapter of Book 2 of Economics. A fascinating subject, economics. It's been my favorite since my days at IIM Bangalore. You know, we had this great teacher. She's now very old lady. She's on the board of Reserve Bank of India, Professor Indira Rajaraman. इतनी खूबसूरती के साथ इकोनॉमिक्स वो पढ़ाती थी कि अनपढ़ को, रिक्शा पुलर को मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स समझ में आ जाता था. तब से मेरे जहन में इतना गहरा बैठा हुआ है कि फॉर इकोनॉमिक्स आई डोंट हैव टू टच एनी बुक, पर्सनली स्पीकिंग, एंड ऑल क्रेडिट गोज टू दैट गुरु ऑफ माइन. Go Google and find out Professor Indira Rajaraman, and I'm going to take a piece of this recording and send it to her with my pranams today after the class. Let's come to the chapter that we are working upon. Chapter 1 is Indian economy on the eve of Indian independence. You know, this entire book, the purpose of the second book is to give you a very good understanding about the features, the attributes, the events, the situation of Indian economy as it dawned in 1947 at the time of independence, and then how has it progressed over the last 75 years. ठीक है, आगे चलते हैं. Developmental policies and experience of the period 1947 to 1990, which was in some sense end of a long era 1. 1991 is the beginning of era 2 of the modern Indian economy. ठीक है? Now, on the eve of independence, you know, as Pandit Nehru was making his speech, Tryst with Destiny, on the 14th of August 1947 at midnight, 14th, 15th night. What was the situation before that and what was the situation much before that? That's what we will start with. सबसे पहले half a minute on, you know, what was the economy like before the advent of British? Before the advent of British, India was a very samriddh nation, very rich in infrastructure, in industry, in handicrafts, in agriculture. And I'll just give two specific examples of the recent history, 1700 and 1800 as an illustration before we move in. There was this French traveler called Bernier who came to India in the 17th century. And then his travelogue, his recollections, his diaries have all been published. And उन्होंने कहा था कि यहाँ पर इतना फूड ग्रेन्स का प्रोडक्शन है कि दे आर एबल टू एक्सपोर्ट इट. 17th century, रिमेंबर. इतना कैटल एंड लाइफ स्टॉक है कि देयर इज नो प्रॉब्लम विथ पुटिंग अ लॉट ऑफ दोज एनिमल्स टू वर्क इन द फार्म्स एंड सो ऑन. इतना ग्रीनरी एंड एग्रीकल्चर एंड एडवांस्ड कैनाल सिस्टम्स है. एंड ही ट्रैवल्ड स्पेशली अराउंड कैलकाटा ऑल द वे टू बिहार. And the canal systems, and from Ganges to the towns and the villages, so many canals have been dug up by putting human labor that agriculture doesn't depend so much only on rainfalls. These are all there on one hand about agriculture in Bernier's diary. Let's take another example. I don't know if you have heard about Makhmal, you know, the muslin cloth made out of silk, which is super fine, just represented the sophistication of textiles in India at that point in time as far as industry was concerned. Remember, we're talking about the pre-industrial revolution. So वहाँ पर handicrafts, कलाकारी हाथों से ही होता था, right? Precious stones, gold, silk, all of them. Why was it called the Silk Route? Because it was so rich and so sophisticated that it could be exported all over the world, and the finest of that came from Dhaka. It was called the Dhaka Malmal. And it was so expensive that only the rich and the super elite and the royalty could afford. So it was called मखमले शाही, which means सिर्फ जो शाह लोग हैं, किंग्स हैं, वही उसको अफोर्ड कर पाते थे। एक और स्टोरी आपने सुना होगा कि वो इतना फाइन हुआ करता था कि उसको आप फोल्ड करके, एक पूरी साड़ी को आप फोल्ड कर कर एक माचिस की डिब्बी में रख सकते थे। ये इट कुड बी एन अर्बन लेजेंड, बट दैट्स व्हाट वाज द word of mouth and perception about Indian textiles. That was before the advent of British. But what happened in the next 200 years? That's what we are going to focus upon. Okay? आगे चलते हैं. What are we going to cover in this? Of course, a minute on this. Then what was the essence of British policy for the next 150 to 200 years before independence and after they came in? That period we will cover. उसका स्पेसिफिक एग्रीकल्चर में क्या पोजीशन था और क्या इम्पैक्ट था, इंडस्ट्रियल सेक्टर में क्या था, व्हाट अबाउट द ट्रेड, डिड द ट्रेड कंटिन्यू एंड इन व्हाट फॉर्म, व्हाट वाज द रिजल्ट ऑफ दैट एट द टाइम ऑफ इंडिपेंडेंस. We'll take a quick look at how was the demography. Demography is about the people, health, education, infant mortality. We will take a quick look at those statistics along with infrastructure before we conclude this first chapter of the second book. ठीक है? चलें आगे? चलिए. Oops. All right. Learning objective, familiarity with the Indian economy, we've covered. I'll skip that. Understand the factors that led to underdevelopment and stagnation, which means आपको चैप्टर शुरू होने से पहले ही इसका निष्कर्ष पता चल गया है कि जो 150-200 साल का जो ब्रिटिश रूल इंडिया में था, उसका नतीजा जो था वो सिर्फ ये था कि there was underdevelopment or perhaps huge decline from where it was as an economy, as a society 150 years ago, and what amount of stagnation we saw in the year or by the year 1947. Exam, very important but very simple, 3 to 4 questions, and the policies that led to the outcomes and what is the cause and effect relationships, इन दोनों पर आप प्लीज खास ध्यान देना. ठीक है? चलिए. ब्रिटिश पॉलिसी 200 years. देखिए, this session is not so much about British bashing. Okay, there is a saying that history is the story written by the victor. ठीक है? अब there was a kind of story that was written about India which continued till the year 1980s and 1990s, where when we went abroad, people would call us as snake charmers. They would laugh at us as Indians कि यहाँ पर तो सड़कों पर गाय और भैंस घूमते रहते हैं. This is a country of where elephants roam around. Those were the kind of storytelling that was done because we emerged from being quite literally a supply ground of slaves for the British and the colonial people in the previous 150 years. Okay? This session is not about bashing the Britishers. This session is about understanding it, and anyone who would come and rule over another country, he or she would rule keeping their own national interests in mind. That is exactly what British did. They were protecting and promoting the interests of the British Empire, the United Kingdom, England and the Queen all through those 200 years. And आप कोई भी policy लेंगे, उसमें other than some exceptions of individuals who are perhaps focused on doing a good here as well as doing good for there, that was a given. This was an exception once in a while. Keep this in mind whenever we talk about various events and policies that evolved in the 100 years prior to independence. So, how did they perpetuate this protecting the British interests in India? Very simple. Invested in places what benefited them. An example, railways. You know, there is this great saying which goes around that if Britishers were not to be there, Indian Railways network would never have happened. But the question is, even 500, 700 years before that, the sea routes, the sea navy, trade, boats, ships, there are evidences and trade that happened between the Kalinga kingdom and the Southeast Asia. Lot of things are there. The point is, when the technological advancement happened and railways was invented, and when that was brought to India, it was brought to India to do that specific lines were set up which would take coal from a coal mines to the nearest port, and then it can be shipped to a European port. So, whether it is a Bokaro और सिंगरेनी और कोलार, गोल्ड निकल रहा है, कोल निकल रहा है, आयरन निकल रहा है, उसको हमको वहां से नियरेस्ट पोर्ट कैसे भेजें, कलकत्ता भेजें, बॉम्बे भेजें, चेन्नई भेजें, वहां के लिए ट्रेन बनाया, वहां से शिप से वो एक्सपोर्ट हुआ. Keep this in mind. There is a very telling evidence of why railway network developed the way it developed. Similarly, at that time, technology was such that what we today call as entire telephone wasn't there. So the communication happened in the form of post offices and telegraph offices. Telegrams were sent. Telex came much later. So all of those were built offices, people, practices to serve the colonial interests. Let's move forward. What was the outcome of all of this? By the time they left, most of the infrastructure was outdated and crumbling. Okay? In agriculture, industry, we'll come to it a little later, but in short, the benefits of industrial revolution never reached India. When I cover the textile, when I cover the industry, I'll spend a minute on it. Similarly, infrastructure. If this was the largest colony of the empire and it had 20 crore people going to 33 crore people in the previous 75 to 100 years, why was infrastructure not developed at par with what was seen in England? Very important question. Okay, so in short, what they did was to meet their needs, and if we say that it bordered on exploitation and looting, it would not be incorrect. And this has been quantified by statisticians and economists in the last 40-50 years. I'll come to that a little later. Let's take each one of these and spend a minute. कहते हैं ना, भारत कृषि प्रधान देश है. उसको आप नंबर्स के हवाले से देखेंगे तो आप देखेंगे कि 85% of India lived in villages. The concept of urbanization had not yet started. Small villages, hamlets, group of people, 100, 200, 500, that was what it is. And 75% of the people were engaged in agriculture at the time of independence in 1947. Okay? What happened? What happened about the area under cultivation in the post-independence era was that the amount of area which was banjar, unused or uncultivatable earlier, that became cultivatable. So the area increased dramatically post-independence. We will cover that. However, because of lack of mechanization, lack of technology, productivity improve नहीं हुआ, पहले भी नहीं था, बाद में भी नहीं हुआ. Like we will cover in some other chapter in economics, investments in agriculture had not happened, and that was a little slow even post-independence, but productivity was going down because technology had not come into agriculture until the time 1947. एक बहुत अहम ज़रूरी important feature or aspect that was there, which was a big handicap या negative about Indian rural economy or agricultural system was the zamindari system. आपने पॉलिटिकल साइंस में पढ़ा होगा कि कांग्रेस और मुस्लिम लीग के बीच में अगर एक पर्टिकुलर एस्पेक्ट पर मतभेद था, इख्तलाफ था, तो वो ये था कि जमींदारी सिस्टम को बरकरार रखा जाए या उसको अबॉलिश किया जाए. कांग्रेस वांटेड टू एलिमिनेट, abolish zamindari system. Muslim League was in favor of continuing it, and that happened post independence. That in Pakistan this was not done the way and the rate and the intensity with which it got done in India. So zamindari system के क्या फीचर्स थे? सिंपल ये था कि ब्रिटिशर्स ने कहा कि उधर का जमींदार को, भाई ये जो 10,000 एकड़ जमीन है इसके जमींदार तुम हो. उसको एक टाइटल भी दे दिया और उसका काम यह था कि कुछ आए ना आए उसने कुछ किराया देना है टू दैट पर्टिकुलर ऑफिसर. ओके, मेरे जमींदार और उस ऑफिसर के बीच में यह भी हो सकता है कि ये किंग हो, इंडियन प्रिंस जो बोलते हैं वो भी हो सकता था. तो ये उसका कलेक्शन ये कर रहा है, इसका कलेक्शन ये कर रहा है, और ये जमींदार जाकर अपना 10,000 एकड़ जमीन को बहुत सारे रेंटेड पेजेंट्स को उसने दे रखा है. और उसका एक ही चीज पर फोकस था कि मैं इन लोगों से इतना बकाया इकट्ठा करूं, हर 6 महीने 1 साल में मैं अपना रखूंगा 20-30 रुपया, 100 रुपये में से 70 पास ऑन करूंगा, अगला वाला 20-30 रखेगा, 30 पास ऑन करेगा. सो द फोकस वॉज ओनली ऑन रेंटल कलेक्शन. इसका नतीजा क्या निकला कि ये जो मिडिलमैन हैं, वेदर इट इज द प्रिंस और द जमींदार, दे वर इनडिफरेंट टू भैया बारिश हुआ कि नहीं, फसल इस बार उगेंगे कि नहीं, अकाल पड़ गया तो कैसे रेंट देगा फार्मर, उससे वो लोग बिल्कुल भी उनका कोई लेना देना नहीं था. They were absolutely focused only on rental collection. And the second thing is, while things are getting developed and implemented in other parts of the world to improve the productivity in agriculture, technology का introduction करना, investments करना, कुछ नहीं होता था. इरिगेशन फैसिलिटीज का इन्वेस्टमेंट्स इसी वजह से नहीं हुआ. 17th सेंचुरी में जब बर्नियर बोल रहा था कि कैनाल्स का इंट्रोडक्शन हो चुका था, जिसमें न सिर्फ पानी का सप्लाई होता था बल्कि ट्रैवल भी हुआ करता था. पीपल वुड गो फ्रॉम स्मॉल कैनाल्स इन स्मॉल बोट्स टू द रिवर गैंजेस, गेट ऑन टू अ बिगर बोट और अ शिप, एंड देन दे ट्रैवल ऑन द गैंजेस. ये entire water irrigation, water navigation, nothing was invested in, and slowly they deteriorated. Okay, fertilizer productivity in different parts of the world, it has begun to happen, did not get introduced. And a big thing that was forced upon the farmer is to tell him what he will cultivate. आपको याद होगा the indigo, चंपारण का जो इवेंट हुआ था, गांधी जी गए थे 1916 में. that was to protest against this very practice by the Britishers, where they forced all the farmers in Champaran to grow only indigo, and they got less money, but they had no option but to do it. So lot of these also led to the protests and the pickup of the anti-British or the India freedom movement. But this is the summary of agriculture if you look at it from, let's say, 1857 to 1947. ठीक है, आगे चलते हैं. Industrial sector, mechanization had not yet happened. We are in that era. Little bit of mechanization was beginning to happen in Europe, but that did not reach India. But what India was very good at were these things for a long time, for generations. Even today, if you go and look up those temples that were built in 1400 and 1200 and 800, अभी भी वो बिल्कुल बरकरार हैं. And आप some of those temples आप जाओगे, you will find that that the top, जिसे गोपुरम बोलते हैं, the peak of the temple is a solid structure weighing multiple tons of stone. Imagine the technology that was there to take that thing all the way and put it on a temple that is 400 feet tall. Imagine the civil engineering technology that was there. Imagine the silks that were there. We spoke about the muslin cloth. So silk, textiles, metals, stones, all of them were handicrafts Indian artisans were very famous for. One of the things that happened progressively was a policy of deindustrialization. Very important. You know what Britishers thought or did was cotton grows here and it is very cheap. So they treated India as a source of raw material, buy it cheap, straight off the farmers, and the zamindari system, the oppressive rule helped them to procure it at close to zero cost. Subsistence level पर खरीद लिया जाता farmers से, उसको ship कर दिया जाता London, and then you convert that into finished clothes, bring it back to India and sell it here. So raw material take away, finished goods ले आओ. This is just one example of how India was treated. It was treated as a raw material source and a sprawling market, big massive market for the finished goods. Not only India, but wherever it sold, wherever it gave them more money, it was sold there. Capital goods industry. Capital goods industry का क्या मतलब है? You know it, you know. As industrial revolution happened, as new things came into existence, you have to invest in building those things so that more machinery can be built. All of this in India, it started more in after 1900s by a couple of these that came up. Cotton mills, jute mills. अब cotton mills करना है तो cotton mill का cotton machinery करना पड़ेगा. वो नहीं हुआ. And the first iron and steel plant came, which was set up by the Tatas. Slowly, little bit of work began to happen in sugar and cement and so on, but it was very slow and it was limited by the amount of money a private industrialist could do because we did not have our government. One of the reasons why post-independence India took the policy that they took. Okay? We've spoken about it. Modern or industrial revolution के benefits, learnings, technologies India तक नहीं पहुंच पाए. Foreign trade, we've covered this, but quickly, it was a restrictive policy and restrictive through production restrictions. भाई तुम ये नहीं कर सकते, तुमको सिर्फ बेचना पड़ेगा. इंडिगो आप ग्रो करोगे, सिर्फ हमको दोगे, हम ले जाएंगे. यहाँ सर यहाँ उसको कन्वर्ट करके कलर करें क्या हम लोग? नहीं, आप नहीं कर सकते. And by putting massive tariffs. What comes from Britain, it comes with this set of tariffs so that it gets promoted, and what goes out, these tariffs will be put to make it cheaper for them to send it away. Okay. One very interesting estimation by modern statisticians, and you can look up the video of Shashi Tharoor on YouTube, okay, where उनको एक डिबेट में इनवाइट किया गया था और उसमें उन्होंने बहुत I think it's a fantastic video for you to watch on YouTube. Just type British Empire and Shashi Tharoor on YouTube and you will get it. And there are various other modern statisticians and historians who have said that from India about $4.3 trillion of today's value of money was drained during the course of the British period. Okay? What happened in trade as a result of many of these policies? That, you know, the trade itself almost died, where we had very rich tradesmen 200 years prior to that. You will be very surprised, very shocked. There are towns in interior parts of Orissa, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, where इतने rich traders थे कि उनके घर जो है वो आलीशान राजास पैलेस दिखते थे 350 साल पहले. And you will be very surprised when you go there. And when you read a history of that village, it says that this village had 12 such merchants who would take all of this from the Malabar coast, put it into the ships, and they would go off for 6 months to Southeast Asia. और नीचे सिलोन से शुरू करते थे, मलेशिया जाते थे, इंडोनेशिया जाते थे, and then they would come back after 8 months or a year. These are there, okay? But all of them vanished. So what happened was the entire foreign trade collapsed, including the structures, the industry, the ships, everything collapsed. And whole lot of it became a monopoly. So India became the monopolistic sweatshop for Britishers to supply the raw materials, and whatever final goods Indians could afford, that would come back here, rest would get supplied to different parts of the world. Okay? Demographic condition. You know what is the definition of demographics? It is the story of the people in terms of statistics and data. Look at some of these. Today, India's life expectancy, which is the average number of years an Indian lives, is touching about 70. At independence, it was 44. Can you imagine that? Average life expectancy was 44. So which means every big leader or every name or your great grandfather, whoever lived beyond 44, 45, 50 was an exception than a rule. Okay? Out of every 1,000 children that were born, 218 children died. Imagine, 21.8%. So you must be wondering many a time, why did the families or couples, why did they have 7 children, 8 children or 10 children in our grandfather's era? That's because you knew that a significant number of them are going to die. So you didn't want to produce 3 children and 2 of them die and left with 1. But 10 हुए, 10 में से 2-3 किसी वजह से देहांत हो गया, तो कम से कम 5-6 बच्चे हैं. Right? Literacy was non-existent, and the 16% literacy of men or 7% of women was essentially limited to the more prosperous and rich and well-off families, not the common man. Okay? One of the things that I would want you to study or read is this. I might have mentioned this in some other session also. Watch this TED talk by a noted statistician. His name is Hans Rosling. That's his photograph. That's his TED talk video. Google it, YouTube it, and watch it. 2 things he establishes by studying the countries and their progress over the last 200 years, which is the first thing that is important for a nation to be successful is health indicators. Bhai, agar 218 bacche, if this falls off to 21 out of 1,000, which means for every 1,000 children, you've got additional 200 people who will grow up healthily, they get educated, and they become productive members of the society. So investment in health is visible as an outcome not after 2 years or 4 years, after 25 years, which is why governments end up doing expenditures on health. Number 2, if somebody survives, is healthy, but is not educated, then the economic value add that he or she is able to do is lesser. So the second important thing that is key for growth of any economy is education. Minimum is literacy, but if they get from the primary education to the secondary to tertiary, which is college today, then instead of being a daily wage laborer on the farm, he could be an agricultural scientist working and doing research and helping his grandparents or his village to improve the productivity. So watch this video, you will get a very good insight and understanding, and it's a nice easy video of about 15-20 minutes. Okay? Infrastructure. The whole motive of infrastructure development was linked, as I mentioned earlier, to just serving the colonial interests. So rails and roads were built primarily for the movement of the British army for various battles and controlling this and controlling that, and goods, and they became as the transportation solution between the source, जहाँ पर खान है या एग्रीकल्चरल प्रोड्यूस है, वहाँ से लेकर पोर्ट को ले जाने का, ताकि वहाँ से यूके को चला जाए. Water transport was limited. It actually declined massively in the 100 years prior to India's independence. Some benefits, of course, like we always talk about, every great thing has some downsides, but even if the motive was to do this, there were some unwitting or incidental positive outcomes of these infrastructure development. Number one, the long distance travels by Indian citizens began to happen. So, like you know, Gandhiji traveled a full year around the country when he came back in 1915-16 from South Africa. All the travel was done on trains and buses. Number two, because of this, the cultural synthesis, mixing up, exchange, all of that began to happen. So the cultural barriers collapsed. People now could see, okay, people from North India, they look like this, talk like this. Cultures moved, languages moved, all of that happened. Okay. One of the other benefits was now, slowly, the agricultural produces, they began to move from one part of the country to another. So there was a time when some vegetables or flowers or food grains from one part of the country was never eaten, consumed or used in another part of the country. That began to happen. So wheat began to happen everywhere. Chapatis would get eaten. Rice would move. All of those began to happen because of the transportation and infrastructure and mobility that came into existence. Okay? To close this quick chapter that sets the tone or the context background when India became independent, some quick conclusions. India was very populous as a country. At the time of independence, we were 33 crore people, which means there was a large number of people, but we had negligible GDP compared to the size of population that we had, and that meant very low productivity. Okay? No technology or investment. So India had to start from scratch and decide what to do and how to do when Jawaharlal Nehru took his oath as the Prime Minister. We were unfortunately hugely untouched and insulated and kept away from the benefits of Industrial Revolution. India had to undo it or begin to do it afresh from the year 1947. In short, on the day that India became independent, the challenges that were there in front of the inaugural cabinet, which was led by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, was enormous, and as you know, everybody was going to be a minister or a public servant or a prime minister for the first time in their lives. That's the context. Hope it was useful. Go and look up the textbook, read it once, and don't miss to Google and spend a few minutes on the Hans Rosling's video, his TED talk. It will give you a great context. Let's see if we could go through a couple of questions before we sign off. Look at this and answer. I've given the answer for you just as a help, but I'm sure you can answer it. Agriculture sector experienced all the following except stagnation था, excess labor था, जमींदारी system था, technology नहीं था. ठीक? Indian demography was characterized by poor health facilities, poor literacy rates, high infant mortality rates, hence all of the above. ठीक? MCQs इस तरह के आएंगे आपको. ठीक है? And what you have to do is was characterized by, आपने ये टिक करके चले जाना नहीं है. Make sure that you come all the way here. That's when you will not make a mistake. ठीक है? That brings me to the end of this session. Read up. See you soon in chapter 2. Have a great time. Bye bye.